Howdy folks, hola ¿qué tal? Today we're going to create a simple Vue counter app using XState, which is a cool library for creating something called state charts or finite state machines. I found out about this library when I saw a tweet from Tanner Lindsley, who is the creator of a React query and React table, about his goal to learn XState. So I started to read about it and found the ideas quite interesting. As I recently created a video on how to create a custom store with Vue and TypeScript, I thought that a tutorial on using XState with Vue would follow naturally. Now, I'm no expert on XState, but will at least get started and configure a state machine today for a counter. Here is a demo of what we'll build today. You can see we have this basic counter app. It has a count that we can increment, and you'll see why I have this double precision here, or at least float. And we can disactivate the count, and you can see that now we can't click this. Furthermore, we show the current state of this counter. Right now it is inactive, so we can click activate, and then we can inactivate it. We also have the ability to change the increment value, and we could maybe change this to 2.33 here. And now if we increment, hopefully it does increment by 2.33, or even we could do a negative number and then do, minus a minus here, and it's increasing. That's what we'll build today, and I hope you're excited to get started. Before we actually write our code in the Vue.js project, the XState developers have created a really awesome visualization tool. In it, we can create our steps with plain old JavaScript objects and visualize the state. Here, we won't go into too much detail, but you can see that we have a sort of state machine for fetching data. So if we are in an idle state, we have one event, these are called events, which will then load or move us, transition us to a loading state. So if I click fetch here, you see in this sort of schema, if that's what it's called, we can see that we're in an idle state. And then we have this on key and fetch, and our events are usually all caps. It will take us to the loading state. So let's click fetch, and it takes us to a loading state. You can also see that we log our events here in this tool. And then we could see what happens if we resolve or reject. And then there are also tools to handle actual promises and asynchronous code in this XState, but we'll not go into those today. So if this loading resolves with data or a payload, we go resolve. And on resolve, we go to the success state. A success state is final. So there's really nothing we can do anymore without resetting the whole state machine. So let's reset it here. And sorry if I'm misusing terminology. I started this 3 days ago. And we can fetch. And we can also have a reject state. And here is something interesting. If we go to the failure state, we're able to retry. And what does retry do? On retry, so let's see, we have a failure state. And if we retry, we want to target the loading state again, but we're going to use an action. Now, an action is sort of a fire and forget. It's not an event. These all caps things are events, but it's a way to do something. In this case, we want to assign this context, or the number of retries. We want to take it, and that's what context.retries plus 1 is, and increase it. So if we go to the state tab here, we have this retry 0, and we'll see some of this later, don't worry. But if I click retry, you'll see our retries is 1. Let's go back and maybe reject the loading and retry again. And it's 2, and then maybe this time we resolve, and we're in a final state. We can't really do anything. Let's now go ahead and build our counter machine. So let's go back to the definition. And here, instead of having a fetch machine, let's call this a counter machine. And we'll give it an ID, which is a name we can use to track which machine we're working with. I'm told in what I saw, it's for debugging purposes. And then we will define our states. Right now, let's not have any context, though we will shortly. And let's make sure to get rid of all of our current states. And we're going to just define an initial state, which is active. And we can just use the key and use an empty object to not really apply any sort of transitions or events to active. Now we have an initial state. We do not have an idle state, so that doesn't make sense. So let's create our initial state of active. And I think I have everything ready. Let's now hit update and we should see this chart change. Great, so we have our very first counter machine, which enters a state of active and does nothing. So that's not super useful. Well, in fact, it's not useful at all. Let's create a second state called inactive. And if you remember in the initial app, we were able to disable our buttons, and that was in the inactive state. And I'm too dependent on developer tools. I always forget commas, but let's update this. Now we have two states. But how can we transition between these states? That is via events. We can define these events per state. So we can have some events that will only happen in the active state and some that will only happen in inactive. Furthermore, we could have a same event, or at least the same event name, that will do different things depending on the state which we're in. That's sort of what we'll do now. We're going to add a toggle state. So if we go to active here, we can add an on, and then we can say on a toggle event, and remember we use all caps here, go to inactive state. And we can do the exact same thing, well, not quite exact, but something similar in the inactive state. Except this time when we toggle, we want to go to, you've got it, the active state. So let's update that. Now you can see we can do some very basic work with our counter machine. If we click toggle here, we enter the inactive state, and if we toggle here, it takes us to the active. So there's no case where we could toggle and go to some other state or stay in the inactive state. So that's one nice thing about these state machines. I also want to mention that there's sort of a more advanced usage of these events. And when we just put the inactive in quotes here or the active in quotes here, let's just change one of these. This would be the same thing. And when you have more complex events, you'll see something like target. I almost wrote type, which is something else. When we toggle, we say the target state is active. And then we can add more fields down here. But I'll get rid of the comma now. I don't know if there's any sort of linting errors in this tool. But you see, nothing changed here. This is still the same state machine. When we use these finite state machines, we track finite states like it's active or inactive using these so-called states. However, if we need states that represent quantitative data, arbitrary strings, numbers, objects, and so forth, when we want to represent these things that can potentially be infinite, we use something called context, which in the technical terms I think is called extended state. So if you go to the guide here, there's a lot of jargon, but I'm going to talk about context. I don't think this is actually that difficult, but there are a lot of terminologies or words to wrap your head around when I first looked at this. When I see the examples, it kind of makes sense to me, but you will have to wrap your head around some terminology. But here's that definition I got on what extended state and context is. As a count can take on a continuous amount of values, I'm going to create a context to store it. So we say context here, and that's at the same level as ID in the initial state. And we wrap it in curly braces and put our count of 0 here. Let's make sure this updates and I don't have any errors. Great. Now you don't see the count here. Oh, that just shrinks it. But if we go to state here, we now see this context and the current value of our state. So the state now, this is great when you access the machine or state in JavaScript, the state active or inactive is accessed on the value key. So that's also helpful to know. Now the question arises, how will we update this count? We can also do this with events. So let's add increment and decrement events for updating the counter. Remember though, that we do not want to be able to update the count if our state is disabled. And this is part of the magic. We can add these states only inside of the active state, meaning we can these events. We can add these events only inside of the active state. Let's go ahead and do that now. I've copied and pasted these two new events. You'll see that we have increment and decrement, and hopefully I have all my tabs right here. I had to adjust that. When we do an increment, we are going to fire an action. And this action, we can fire multiple actions, which is why I put them in an array. But if it was a single action, I do believe you can just do this. But let's get that array back. And so we define the name of the actions here. And so we'll have increment and decrement, and these can only be accessed inside of the active state. Now, it is possible to inline or create these actions here, but another way to do it is to create a second argument to the machine. Notice that I'm at the machine level here, and after this closing bracket, we can open up another object and close it. And this object will have the actions in it. So we can say actions, and then define increment count here. And this is a little tricky now. When you want to update this context or extended state, we first define an action, and then we can say something like assign, and we use this assign function, which takes the keys of the context. So we have count here, so we have access to that. But then to change this key, we actually get access to a function, which has the context, and I'll write it this way, and the event details. And so we can actually pass more data onto the event than just the name or type. So the decrement is kind of the type of the event, but we could also send an event with values or payloads. We don't need that for this particular assignment. So we'll just take the context here, and I'll use a simple arrow function. And we'll say ctx.count plus 1. Let's see if that updates. I'm sure I have some errors. No, wow, it's a miracle. All right, and then this decrement I have not wired up, but we will in a minute. Let's just see if when we increment, you see it says it does inc count, which is the action. And so let's go to our state here, and if we click increment, that is working, and we've yet to wire this up. We'll do that soon. To do this, I'm going to do a little refactoring. Let's get rid of these comments. And then up at the top, instead of adding this assign function here, I'm going to bring these outside of the machine. So we're going to have an increment count function, or just actually, it's just the assign function being called here. And we're going to have a dec count. So we can actually get rid of this function here, and we can use JavaScript syntax shorthand to just add our inc count key. And if it's inc count just by itself, the value will be what is stored in increment count here, which is assign. And then we have decrement, which will subtract. So let's add decrement or dec count below. Okay, let's hope this works. Doesn't appear to be any errors. Let's go to our state, and we can decrement our count. Works like a charm. Before we add the ability to multiply our counter, instead of just going up and down by 1, let's first actually start building the Vue app before we go too far along. I'm going to use the Vue CLI, which if you don't have it, you could just install it with npm install g or global flag at Vue CLI, I believe. But I have that already installed, so I'm going to use Vue create, and let's just call this Vue XState live. And I'll probably skip through the scaffolding here, but just so you know the settings I'm going to use here, I'm going to manually select features. I'll use Babel. We're not using TypeScript today, though I generally like to, and I want to use a linter and formatter. Vue3 is important because we're going to be using Vue composables, which requires Vue3 or at least some updating of your Vue2 app. I like prettier, and I want to lint on save, dedicated files. Good. So let this run, and I'll open the Vue app shortly. I'm here inside of the scaffolded Vue application. I haven't checked all my settings yet, but let's hope my Vue configuration works all right. First, let's just get rid of, we don't even need this component folder. We're going to do everything inside of app.vue. We don't need a logo or any assets. And we can go to app.vue here, and basically let's get rid of everything and I'll show you a starter template. Now this is a Vue setting, let me fix that and get right back. My IDE just wanted me to have a JSON config.json file that says to look in the source for Vue files. Inside of here now, let's add the basic code to get started. Inside, we are just going to add a basic counter app, some buttons that aren't wired up, a counter here in an H3, a button to activate and inactivate the state machine, and the current state, whether it's active or inactive. You notice my script has nothing, and I have a little margin around the buttons. And to run a Vue app in development mode, it's npm run serve. If we load this application, I had it already loaded before, let's reload it. We can see we just have some buttons, a count, and some current state. None of this is wired up yet. Our first item of business is to create a machine. Let's go ahead and do that by creating a new file called countermachine.js. Now you could do this in the app.vue file, but then it gets a little bloated, so I'll add it here. And to create this, we basically need to import a couple of things. We need to import the assign function from XState and create machine. Now this create machine is a different way or factory for instantiating a machine. I'm not sure of all the differences, but I know in a lot of the TypeScript examples, they're using create machine. And when I was looking at some GitHub issues, it does appear that they're moving towards this instead of just this sort of machine constructor looking function. I don't know what it is under the hood. I have not looked at it yet, but we'll use these. And then we can basically copy and paste our code from the visualization tool. Of course, I need to first install XState, which is kind of important. So let's actually exit out of this and I'll install XState. And we also need to install something called at XState/Vue, which will give us a Vue composable function for working with this machine's state and events. Now that that's installed, I'm going to actually just copy and paste the visualization code that we just had. I have some prettier errors here, and I'm going to need to do some exporting. First of all, let's use create machine here. And let's see if this is mostly prettier. And our warning is that I am not exporting this. And let's do that. So let's say export, and we'll make it a default export. It's called counter machine here. If I could type, semicolon, and that's good. Let's go back to our app view and see how we can use this. The first things we need to do are import a composable function called useMachine from, and that's when we're going to use this XState Vue library. Then we need to also import that machine we just created, which should be a sibling, counter machine from, and it should be same folder, counter machine. Excellent. Now to use the machine or these composable use functions, which are similar to React hooks, probably people will start calling them hooks, we can extract using this use machine the state and also a send, which is used for sending events. And then we pass to use machine the actual machine that we instantiated. All right, we're not using these yet. Now with Vue composition functions in the setup, any value we want to be or object we want to be accessible in our template, we need to return from the setup function. So let's return state and send here. And that should get rid of our warnings. Now let's update some of our template to be able to access the events for incrementing, decrementing, and toggling the state. Let's first update this button here. Let's create a click event with @click. And when this happens, I want to send, not sned. Sned is maybe your friend's name. And we're going to send an increment event. And we don't have any payload. Otherwise, we could add a second argument. And then I want to actually bind to the disabled normal HTML property here. But if we put a colon in front of it, we bind disabled, meaning true or false if it's disabled, to a sort of helper method. I don't know if that's the right term, but it's called match. And this checks if our state is in the inactive state. And this is actually state.matches, and that's why I had the error there. All right, we're going to do something very similar in this other button, except that we want to call decrement. And that's good. Now, just to mention this state.matches that's going on here, sometimes you might have nested sort of state, and you have this tree, and inside one state you might have more states. So it'll first look for an event in the current state in the tree, and then it will sort of percolate or bubble up if that's, I may be using the wrong terms, but that's why you have this matches, because it might look for the state at a higher level. And if you just said if state.value equals inactive or equals inactive, that would work here, but this is a better way to do it. Let's now update our count to use the context. Remember, that's here, the context's count. We'll do it like so. We'll give our Vue template double curly braces, which I always mess up when I've been using React. We're going to access the state context. Even though we're not using TypeScript, the library is written in TypeScript, so we're getting a little bit of help here. That might be because I have Vue configured. And I'm going to use toFixed because later when we add that increment value, this will help us out a bit to not have tons of decimal points. Sorry if I just blew out my mic. I get excited and talk really loud. And then in this activate, inactivate thing, I want to actually go in here and create a computed property to determine if this label will be activate and inactivate. Let me copy and paste that and then just hopefully explain it to you. Here is our toggle button label. It will be a computed function or a computed property, which we'll need to import from Vue. And when you use Composition API to use these watchers and computed properties, the same as you would have in the old Vue Options API. I don't want to say old, it's still used. In this case, you actually have to import it, is what I'm trying to say. So as I mumble from Vue. So, okay, now we just need to export this toggle button label to make it available to our template. But what does our toggle button label do? It checks our current state's value. Remember, we access the state with state.value. So that will be our active or inactive state here. If the current state is active, then we're going to return the button label of inactivate. And if the current state is inactive, we want the button to say activate. Otherwise, if we get some other sort of state match, which we hopefully shouldn't, I'm going to return a label. I'm kind of impressed that you got to this state. So now we can just add this toggle button label here. There we go, and I should be able to save, and hopefully things are working. Let's go ahead and run this again with npm run serve, and once this runs, I'll open the app and show it to you. Let's refresh this application, and let's see if our incrementing and decrementing is working. And if we click inactive, oh, that's not working. Let's see what's wrong. Well, I didn't actually send any event to toggle the state on this button. So let's add an @click event. And you guys probably saw this from the start and were screaming at me. Scream louder next time so that way I can hear you. And we'll send toggle. I think that's all I'll need to do with this button, because there's no need to check what the state is. We call toggle no matter what state we're in to go to the other state. Let's save. And back to the app. Increment and decrement works. And if I click inactivate, you notice that this now says activate, and we have increment and decrement. Very good. Oh, and let's update the current state as well. See, I should have scripted myself a little better, but let's just add here to the current state. We'll just say state.value. Excellent. And there we go. Active, inactive. Now let's add the multiplier state. You might remember at the very bottom, I'm going to make it so that we can increment and decrement by varying values. To do so in the template, I'm going to first add the markup. we'll just have a little header that says increment by. And inside a div, just to give it a little space, this is probably a block element. I probably don't need this div. It's here, oh well. We're going to make a number input, and we're going to bind this as a number value to an inc val. And then we also want to disable this if our state is inactive. So we can disable form inputs as well as things like buttons. To bind this to an inc val, we need to, in the setup function, create a piece of state to hold this inc val. And we can do that with something called a ref in Vue 3 with the composition API or the reactivity API to be more specific. So let's import ref. And then we can just wrap this ref in 1. So we want our initial multiplier or increment value to be 1. So we're not using this. To make it accessible, we need to return it as well from our setup function. And let's save. Good, we have a problem. I don't know if I had a typo in inc val here. I didn't see it, but the problem seems to have gone away. Excellent. We can now change the value of this increment by. And if we go into the new Vue Dev tools, which I don't know if they work with Firefox yet, but let's refresh it. Sometimes the components don't load. There we have our app component. And if I increase or decrease this, you can see our inc val updates. Now we want to send an event to update this increment value in our state now. To do this, I'm going to actually create another sort of watcher that watches for changes to increment value. So just like we can with normal old Vue, we can create an options field. We can actually add something called a watch effect here. And anytime anything that's reactive, and this inc value ref is reactive, so anytime this changes, we can call something or run a side effect. And here's the exact side effect that we're going to run. I'm just going to copy it, and this is not imported, so we also need to import this from Vue. Excellent. So what's happening here is we're going to send an event called update inc value for update increment value. And in all of these events that we have so far, you can see we just send an event name, but we can also send a payload with these events, and we can send them from inside of our Vue setup or options API as well. We have access to send. So we'll send this, and the increment value will be either the value of this inc value or 0. And the reason I do or 0 is if you have an empty value on the form here, let's reload this. I don't know why it's not working, but if I were to go empty here, you can see that the ref is an empty string. So I want our state machine to treat empty as the value 0. Let's now add this event and the context to our counter machine. So now I want to store an increment value in our state machine as well in the context, and we'll start that out as 1 as well. No trailing commas this time, though I usually use that. Next, we need to add another event at this level, I think. Yes. Let's add, actually that's a state. We need to add an event to our active state called update inc val. Remember, it was all caps, and I don't know if I'm supposed to use underscores here or not, but we're going to do it. And then we want to fire an action in the actions array called update inc val. This will be very similar to what we already did. And let's create this function. It will be a little different. So up here we have increment count and decrement count. In update increment value, which we're not using yet, we'll use it shortly, we're going to take the event. And remember, this event has a type. That's what's sent in this send. Has a type of update inc val and this actual payload as well of inc val. So we can get this event as the second argument to the function in assign. Remember, we get the keys. We can change any of these keys of the context. And so we're going to take the event and assign its value or the value of increment val to our context increment val. Maybe I could have made these names clearer, but that's how it works. Now, in these two functions, we can update by context.incval and decrement by context.incval. Very good. The last thing we need to do is make sure that this is accessible in that second argument of create machine. So this is the outer one here, and we added in actions. So we'll call this, actually, what did I call it? I called it update incval. And it looks like all our problems for this application at least have gone away. And let's see if our app is working. So we can increment, decrement, disactivate, or inactivate. I keep saying disactivate. I think that's a word too. It disables this. That's good. Let's reactivate it, and let's make this maybe 7.5. So something's not wired up. Let's go ahead and check what that is. It may be that I need to do a hard reload because I've changed the store. Let me see. I save that. Let's give this, yeah, that's not working. Let me do a hard refresh and put this to 3. Still not it. I'll find out shortly what's wrong here. If I look at my console.log, it looks like it says no implementation for update dat incval. So there is the problem, I hope. So if we go here, I must have had a typo. Update incval and update. Let's hope this fixes it. And let's give it a hard refresh. Looks okay. Some dev tool warnings. We won't worry about that with you here now. And let's try. There we go. Excellent. So our app appears to be working as we expected. Thanks, guys, for joining me again. My tutorials do get a little bit long. I talk a lot. But even though this was basic, I hope you're as excited to dig into some more XState as I am. I'm thinking of making another XState video using TypeScript and handling asynchronous data fetching. There are some nice tutorials already with Vue and React to do this sort of data fetching, but I want to see if we can get them to work with the use machine composable for Vue. I also want to use TypeScript because I'm thinking that we could maybe do some exhaustive type checking. So if we type all of these various states and what we expect their events and payloads to be, maybe we can say, hey, I want to make sure that I'm checking all possible states and rendering a UI accordingly using exhaustive type checking. And if you're not sure what that is, go ahead and look up TypeScript's docs on discriminated unions. That's discriminated unions. Anyway, let me know if you're interested, though I hope to do it anyway. It may take me a while because I'll have to dig in a little deeper. Anyhow, thanks for joining again and again. Hasta el próximo. Ciao.